Welcome to this screencast on developing with the Microsoft Graph. Let me first talk a little bit about what this screencast is and what you can expect from it before we start diving into the content. This screencast is going to accompany a hands-on lab and a training module that you can take advantage of that goes along with everything you're going to find in this screencast. Specifically, you're going to find in this screencast is really going to be an example of someone presenting the content from the training module as a way for you to learn how you could use this module and delivering it to a different user group or at a conference. However, you can also use it as self-paced learning. Now, the way that this module is set up is that it's broken up into a series of a couple different sections. We'll go through each one of them in just a few minutes. Each one of these sections is going to finish with a demonstration. Now, the demonstration, we don't walk through the entire step of creating the application or walking through the steps of writing all the code. Instead, we look at the final solution that has already been built and kind of pick through the code and pick through the important parts that you should take advantage of or you need to take note of. And we'll see it working as well. If you want to go through and you want to build the application, you want to see how it's being built, then what we would recommend that you do is go check out the hands-on lab that accompanies this module. Because the hands-on lab, each of the exercises maps to one of the demos inside of this screencast that you're going to see. So if you want to see how to build it and you want to walk through the steps, you can walk through the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module and get to the exact same place that we're showing you here in the screencast. Instead, we're not going to show in the screencast all the individual steps of creating the application. And part of that is because things change on a rapid cadence, and the lab is going to have the most updated steps and dependencies and stuff that you're going to need. The screencast is more or less showing you how the thing works or how the final solution works. So that's how you can learn more about taking advantage of this content and how we've structured this. Let's go ahead and dive into the actual module itself. In this module, we're going to see how to build a React single-page application using the Microsoft Graph. We're going to start with an introduction to the Microsoft Graph API and then getting started, and then what code samples and SDKs are available to us. Office 365 Developer Vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. And as a developer, you can bring your application into the user experience. With over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your application, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your application. There are currently over 850 million events created each month and a total of over 400 petabytes of data stored in the service that can add value for your users. The Microsoft Graph is the gateway to your data in the Microsoft Cloud. As you see there from the bottom of the list, we've got a lot of different services and data types that we can actually take advantage of from Office 365 and Microsoft. And it's all considered part of the Microsoft 365 platform. We can work with mail and calendar, contacts, tasks. We can work with content inside of SharePoint sites and lists, files inside of OneDrive, things inside of Microsoft Teams, users inside of Azure Active Directory. There's so many different things that we can take advantage of. The nice thing here is that each one of these different services usually has its own API where we can talk to these different services to get the data out. It can be challenging to go get the data from all these individual services as they each have their own endpoints, they may have their own permissions, and that also means that with their different access control that we have and talking to these different services using an OAuth-style authentication via Azure Active Directory, that means that each one of these different endpoints is going to have to require their own access token. One of the nice things about the service called the Microsoft Graph is that the Microsoft Graph is going to serve as a proxy endpoint to all of these other different services. It's going to encompass things such as Office 365, Windows 10, and Enterprise Mobility and Security. And it brings all of these different services under one top-level service called graph.microsoft.com. The advantage to using the Microsoft Graph is that it's going to allow you to just have a single point resource, which means you're only going to need a single access token to be able to talk to all of these different services. They still have their own individual permissions, or as we refer to them as scopes, so that everything is still secured in a very individual way. But this makes it easier for developers to build applications. Now, one of the nice things about the Office 365 API or the Microsoft Graph API is that I mentioned that they were like a proxy to other endpoints that each one of the different services implements. Like we have different Office 365 services and APIs for Outlook or for OneDrive or OneNote or Planner, Microsoft Teams, etc. Well, the nice thing about the graph is that, again, it's a proxy to all those services. So you don't have to know how to talk to each one of those services or obtain an access token for each one. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that because it's a proxy, you may see new functionality and features show up in these downstream endpoints prior to when they get them and they show up inside of the Microsoft Graph. And that makes sense because the Microsoft Graph is a proxy and it can't expose functionality that doesn't exist downstream in one of the services that it's proxying. So you may have to wait a little bit for it to show up either in the beta endpoint or in the V1 endpoint of the Microsoft Graph. Some examples of this are webhooks when they were introduced to Outlook, and also when time zones were introduced when the time zone support was introduced for calendar items. Now, Office 365 has a single authentication flow for Office 365 and the Microsoft Graph. Users are going to sign in using a technology called OpenID Connect, which is an open standard. And what that does is that once people have logged in, there's this nice little envelope wrapper that will include details about the individual who's just logged in. Azure AD is going to be used for all of the authentication. The Microsoft Graph is built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. Office 365 is also built on top of the authentication model of Azure AD. So both of these services trust Azure AD. By having this single level of trust or single service that they both trust, then we can leverage the authentication to take advantage of both of these different services with the same authentication flow. This authentication flow is also going to support multi-factor authentication, also referred to as MFA, and federated user sign-ons. And it's going to support all different kinds of applications, from device applications such as those on a mobile device, websites, single-page applications that live 100% in the client, or as a headless application with no user involvement, also referred to as a daemon or as a service-based application. You'll be able to pin applications to your Office 365 app launcher from the My Apps page, which is like that little menu that you have in the top left corner within Office 365. Now, one of the concepts we have with Azure AD, and it comes into play with the Microsoft Graph, but it really is an Azure AD thing, and that's called the Common Consent Framework. So what happens is that if you think about permissions and being able to gain access to some service, you really have like a triangle of things that you need. We have the permission, we have the user or the application, and you have the resource that you're trying to talk to. So the resource is the Microsoft Graph, the user and the application, and then you also have the permission. So the user needs to have the permission to the resource to be able to talk to it. Well, the first time the user goes to log in to Azure AD to obtain an access token to talk to the graph, Azure AD is going to look and see, has this user granted this application access to the Microsoft Graph? And specifically, has it granted access to with these permissions? And so the way that this works is that if the user has not gone through this process yet, then the Common Consent Framework kind of kicks in. And after they log in, you'll see a dialog that looks a little bit like what you see there on the right of the slide. What this is saying is that effectively behind the scenes, it's saying you've never granted this permission to this endpoint with this application. So do you now grant that permission? And so what this is doing here, this is called the delegated consent. What this is doing is this is me granting a specific application. So in this case here, it says the publisher's website, what's the name of the app? I'm going to grant this permission to the Microsoft Graph. Or in this case specifically, is I'm just granting it to Azure AD. So reading directory data and signing me in and reading my profile. If I was talking to, say, my files or to my mail, it would have other permissions that were listed there as well. This is like an end user consent. I also have the ability to grant admin consent. And what that means is that is me as a tenant administrator granting these permissions by this application to a resource on behalf of everybody in my organization. That's a much more widespread permission that I'm granting. And it's not always required, but it is required at some point. So it's just an option that's available to you. Now, with the graph, we do have two ways that we can authenticate, or with Azure AD, there's two ways we can authenticate, and the graph supports both of them. Now, one way you can do is Azure AD only. And what this is that this says that you're only going to be using a work or school account to authenticate to the Microsoft Graph or to Azure AD, and then use that to go talk to that access token to talk to the Microsoft Graph. The other option is you can use converged auth, which is Azure AD and or Microsoft accounts. And in this case here, what's nice about this is that depending on how I log in, I use the exact same code in the Microsoft Graph, the same endpoints, the same SDKs to get my files either in OneDrive Consumer or OneDrive for Business. And I just use OneDrive as an example. The same is true for calendar and contacts and email inside of Outlook.com or in Exchange in Office 365. But the nice thing about this is that the data that you're going to go fetch is all dependent based on the login of the user that actually logged in. So I don't have to specify any special code or any special APIs or endpoints to get data for consumer accounts or for business accounts. Now, again, with the SharePoint framework, this doesn't really apply because we're only going to be logging into SharePoint Online using an Azure AD account and not a Microsoft account. Now, let's talk a little bit about Microsoft account and Azure AD accounts. This is something I just kind of mentioned a minute ago, where many apps will let you use either a Microsoft account and a Azure AD account, or I guess it's more of an or. The advantage here is that everything is the exact same. It's just a setting of what you support when you register the app inside of Azure AD. The Microsoft Graph has a single endpoint, single for all data, either business data or consumer data. Now let's talk about creating a React single page application that's been configured with MSAL for authentication with Azure AD. You're going to first create a React single page application, and one of the easiest ways to do that is by using a tool called the Create React App. So we're going to go through that. That happens in the lab. Then we're going to install any additional packages that we need. So we have things like a router, some UI stuff for like say Bootstrap, Font Awesome, some date manipulation stuff with Moment, MSAL for authentication, and the JavaScript client for the Microsoft Graph. And then we're going to go build out the application. So in this demo, we're going to look at an application that we've already created using React, and we're going to just see how this works without any kind of functionality enabled with it, any kind of authentication that's been set up, or any kind of code or business logic for talking to the Microsoft Graph. Now, this module, like many of the other Graph modules, we don't walk through all of the steps of creating the application in the interest of time in the screencast, and also because a lot of dependencies can change from the time the screencast happened. However, what we do is we walk through the built application and just kind of explain some of the main pieces of it and how you would actually configure it and run it. Now, if you are interested in seeing how to build this from scratch, we do maintain a hands-on lab that is the result of the demo. So we use the result from the hands-on lab exercise in the demos. And you can use that if you want to follow along and see how to create a React-based application that uses the Microsoft Graph. That hands-on lab is inside of the training module that is associated with this screencast. And so just refer to that and that exercise if you're interested in a step-by-step process. So let's go ahead and dive into the demo. In this first demo, let's take a look at an application that I've created, a React application I've created using the utility Create React App, which is a command line tool that is going to give me the ability to build to our React application. Now, I've already gone through and created this, and if you want to see exactly how to go about creating the application, again, as I've referred to already, you can jump over and look at the hands-on lab that's associated with the training module that this screencast is associated with. So I went ahead and ran this utility, And then I had to go through and start doing a little bit more work to go through and to configure this. So some of the things that I did is I went through and I installed a couple additional NPM packages, such as Font Awesome, the Microsoft Graph JavaScript JavaScript SDK, Bootstrap, Moment, the Microsoft Authentication library, the React Router, and React Strap, which is a tool to configure our it's a tool that we can use to configure our application for a React app to be able to use Bootstrap. All right. So I also then, now I went in to go build the application. So the first thing that we did is I created a navigation bar for the app, and that's here in navbar.js. So all this does is I'm importing in a lot of controls from Bootstrap or from React Strap, and I'm also importing the React Router. So a couple things that we have here with the code is I have a function here called use the avatar, which is going to display a image of a picture. So if I have an image with the person, I can actually show that. I also have our authorization or authentication navigation item here. So if the user is authenticated, so what it has is it shows a drop down here showing our user avatar, and then it also shows a menu. And the menu is going to show things like our username and our email address and a sign out button. However, if they're not logged in, I'm going to show a navigation item to sign in. Then I'm going to create my navigation bar component. So this component, when it renders out, it's going to render out our navigation element here. So this is going to be our calendar link. So it's going to show a calendar link, or that's the link that it's going to end up creating. And then farther down, here's our entire nav bar. And this is the thing that's going to contain all of the login capabilities to it, the authenticated navigation item, and the navigation bar, and all that other stuff that we've created. So listing out all of our documents, listing out our calendar as well, if we wanted to see those different things. Or sorry, our documents. These are our docs to the Microsoft Graph documentation. So that's the nav bar. The next thing that we also have is a home page for our app. So under welcome.js, we have our welcome component, which is really just a big control here that we've created here. The Jumbotron is coming from the React Strap library. And see, we've got some welcome content. So if the user is authenticated, we can display that. We can display if the user, we can display some information about the user, and we have an authentication button as well. This welcome content is coming from this component that you see that's defined up here, where this is just returning back a div where it's saying welcome to whoever the user is, and use the navigation bar to go ahead and get started if they're currently authenticated. If they're not authenticated, we want to show a button that says click here to sign in. I've also got an error message that is defined here to show if there's any problems that pop up inside of our application that we've created. And then there's some CSS to handle some of the styling. And then finally, we have our app.js. So this is the core of our application. So our app constructor, he has a state that's been set up that's got an authenticated property, who the current user is, and any errors. And then here inside of the render method, this is where I'm defining my router, and the container is where the what's going to be displayed on the in the application, depending on what route that we're on. The nav bar here is just used for the navigation at the very top. So let's see this thing work in action. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, because it doesn't really do all that much right now, other than just display a login prompt. And we can't really do anything with the login prompt because, well, it doesn't exactly, the login prompt doesn't work yet. We haven't done anything with Azure Active Directory or the Microsoft Authentication library. So here what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run npm start. So the first thing I did to get this running was I did npm install, and that downloaded all of the dependencies that were defined inside of package.json, actually all of these dependencies that were defined in package.json inside of the node modules folder. So if I did npm install, it would download all those, and then next I say npm start to start running the application. So this is going to launch a browser, spin up a local web server, and navigate to a browser, which Here we go. So it's gone and launched it. And now we have our Graph React tutorial. So you can see there's a link to the docs. There's our sign in link. Here's our home link. And then here's a click here to sign in. But that's not going to take me anywhere because we haven't added any kind of functionality just yet. So in the next demo, the next section, we're going to talk about the authentication requirements, and then we're going to get the authentication set up inside of our application. But first, let's go back to the slides and talk a little bit about how authentication works with Azure AD in the client. In this section, we're going to continue with our building a React single page app with the Microsoft Graph, but we're going to focus on the authentication piece to it. So we're going to look at how to create and register an Azure AD application using the Azure AD admin portal, how to configure the credentials, selecting the type of the application, and optionally setting any permissions, all of your permissions. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to use the Azure AD admin portal to configure and create your application. If you have an Azure subscription, you can use the Azure portal to do that. But if you don't have an Azure subscription, you can log in using aad.portal.azure.com. And that's going to allow you to log in either with an Azure AD account or a Microsoft account to manage app registrations. From this portal, you'll be able to create web applications, native applications, including mobile, and single page applications as well. You can obtain an application ID and a secret for use in a custom code solution, define scopes and permissions ahead of time, but it also supports defining scopes and permissions at runtime, so having the actual request for the scopes be defined when the application's running instead of having to grant them ahead of time. So how do we go about creating our application? Well, the way you're going to do this is you're going to go to the Azure AD admin portal and you're going to create a new application, and you're going to have to specify a name and a redirect URL. Then you can optionally add any permissions. Now this is optional because if you add the permissions at this point, this is considered static consent, meaning that these are all the permissions that the application is going to require and prompt the user for. However, you can do dynamic consent where the permissions are declared when the user runs the application here. Now, for the demo that we're going to do with this, we're just going to go through and creating the application. We're going to take all the stuff that we use to implement the application, the Microsoft Authentication library and all of those things. We're going to wait to add those things at the very end. So we'll see that in just a few minutes. But first, let's go through and let's create our Azure AD application. All right, in this demo, what we're going to do is we're going to create a Azure AD application for use inside of a client-side application, a single page app, and a web framework. So what I'm going to do is come over here to my, I've already gone ahead and logged in to the Azure AD portal by just going to aadportal.azure.com. So I go to Azure Active Directory, and I'm going to go to app registrations to create a new application. So I'm going to create create a new registration, and this is going to be called my Graph Tutorial. Right? And then I'm going to specify that I want any account to be able to use this. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to specify the redirect URI of where I want my user to go back to. So in this case, I'm going to choose http/localhost. And then I'm probably going to want to put a port on the end of this. And it really is going to depend on the port that I want to use for the tooling that I use. So for example, if I'm using building a React-based application using the Create React app utility that's very common with React, it has a default URL of 3000, or port of 3000 where it spins up its local web server. If you're doing Angular, then it uses the port of 4200. So you can have a couple different ports that you can end up using here. I'm going to specify 3000 on this one, and I'm going to actually go add in another one in just a minute for 4200. So I can use this in any kind of a client-side app. So I've got one defined here, and then I'm going to add in another one over here for HTTP localhost 4200. Okay, and then we will just save that change. Now that that's done, let's go back to the overview. And what I want to do is I want to make sure I grab this application ID. I'm going to need that later, so I'm going to copy it, and we're just going to paste it off in somewhere else for just a moment. Now the next thing I need to do under authentication is I need to configure this app for client-side, supporting client-side auth, or specifically something called the implicit flow, which means I don't have to pass a secret along, but I will support the implicit grant. It allows us to do things like for our single page applications. So I'm going to say I want to use access tokens and ID tokens. Those are both things that can be returned. And then I will save my changes. And that's everything I need to do to get my app all configured and set up. So now let's switch over to our application and let's go configure it to use this service or this new app that we just created. All right, let's continue with adding in the Microsoft Authentication library and working with Azure AD in our React app by looking at some code changes that we've had to make to our application, and then add in the app ID for what we just for the app that we just created. So inside of my app, I'm going to look for this config.js. So I'm going to go ahead and just rename this to config.js, and I'm going to grab the app ID from Azure AD, or that I copied earlier from Azure AD, and paste it in. So that's the ID for my application. Now you see I've got two scopes that have been defined, users.read and calendars.read. These are two things that I'm going to need inside of my application. Now, inside of app.js, you'll notice here that I have added in a reference to the user agent application on MSAL, and I'm also going to be importing in this config as well. So let's now implement our authentication piece for our application. So first thing I'm going to do is inside of the constructor is I'm going to make a couple changes to it to set up the authentication piece right here. And so I'm going to add in all of this code right here. That's going to create a new user agent application. The authentication is going to specify the app ID that we just updated in our config file. There's our redirect URL. And then what the cache location is going to be for the access token. That's going to store this inside of our local machine, or inside of our browser, inside of local storage. And then here is where we're going to go fetch the actual account. Now I need to also implement the login method. So if I scroll down and find a login method, here we go. So our login method, when this runs, we're going to trigger from that user agent, I'm going to trigger the login pop-up and specify here are all the permissions we want, and the prompt is to select the account. And then I'm going to say go ahead and go get the user profile. That's going to go fetch this user profile is the one we looked at earlier in our last demo. And then we've got a little bit of error handling code that is associated with this as well. And then we also are going to have a logout button that is simply going to go call the user agent application.logout. Now that the login and the logout methods are implemented, I need to update the navigation bar and the welcome elements in the render method of the app class. So let's go up and find our render method. Here we go. Here's our render method. Let me give us a little bit more real estate. And here inside of the is authenticated, I'm going to set that equal to the state of is authenticated, which you'll see listed right here as well. And then I'm also going to set the authentication button equal to the logout button or the logout function. So if I'm not authenticated, then, or if I am authenticated, then I want to bind to the logout button. Otherwise, I want to bind to the login button for when I want to go and authenticate. Now, I'm also going to replace the existing welcome code here to display the login button. I'm going to have that be bound as well. And then finally, on the get user profile method, we're going to make one change to the get user profile method. Or I guess we had to add this. We didn't have this before. So get user profile, we hadn't defined this earlier. This is going to fetch an access token by trying to acquire the token silently and get the token this way. And then once I get a token, I can say go get the user details, and I'm going to update the state, which triggers React to do the re-rendering of my application here. So this calls the acquire token silent method to get the access token, and then just outputs the token that we get back. So let's give this a shot. So I'm going to come over here and do npm start. Now we have our application is all set up. So let's go ahead and sign in. So I'm going to click sign in. That opens up the login, and I'm going to choose the account that we've been using for our authentication. So let's go ahead and grab the password, pass in the password here. And here, now that I'm logging in, it's going to ask me to grant specific permissions. So here we can say I want to read calendars and the graph tutorial is the name of the application. So I'll go ahead and click accept. And here we go. It's got my name. It's got listed out as the name of the user I currently logged in as, and it even shows my email address as well. So fantastic. Now we've got all of our stuff to go ahead and to grab the application and go grab the user. Now, one of the things you didn't see here is if I go back over here to the code, is inside of the code on the graph service, we've already done a little bit of stuff with the graph. Here what I'm doing is I'm getting the current user's details from the graph client. And I'm doing that by getting an authenticated client. So here I'm saying graph.client.init, and I'm passing in an auth provider with the access token. And now once I have the token, I can say API or client.api/me and get the actual user and have that user come back. Then inside of app.js, you'll see here at the top, I'm getting the user's details. So I'm getting that function that we just exported. And then inside of the user profile function, get the user profile, that's where you see I'm calling get user details. That's how I'm fetching that and passing in that access token to get the user's details. So that's everything I want to show you in this demo. In the next section, we're going to talk about integrating more of the Microsoft Graph SDK into our application. So let's jump on to the next section. In this last section in this module, we're going to see how to integrate the calls to the Microsoft Graph using Azure AD and Microsoft Authentication Library inside of our React application. First, you're going to install the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK, and you can get that from npm. You can get that as using the @Microsoft/Microsoft-Graph-Client. Now you can use any version that you want that's available to us. Obviously, the more recent versions have the latest capabilities. This slide is simply showing you how you would install a specific version, in this case, version 1.5.2. You just include the @ with the version number at the very end. Now, how do you obtain an access token using the Microsoft Authentication Library? The way you're going to do that is you're going to call this.useragentApplication.acquireTokenSilent, and you can pass in any of the scopes that you want to define. Now, when you get the access token back, you can set it using the capability of state management inside of a React app. You can use the this.setState to set the state of the user and specifying that they are currently authenticated. You can see here we have this little bit of error trapping too if there's a problem. But a nice thing with this is that where I'm getting the user profile, I'm specifying the access token, and obtaining the access token using the Microsoft Authentication Library, and then just saving the state that the current user is authenticated. Now, to get all of the events from the Microsoft Graph, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a method called getOnAuthenticated and pass in the access token. That's going to give me back a Microsoft Graph client that we can use to call the Microsoft Graph to get some information. So in this case here, I'm calling client.api/me.events, and that's going to give me all of my events from my calendar. Then I can use the select Fluent API to get just specific fields, sort things using order by, and then issue the get to go get a list of all of those results and then return those results back. So what does the experience look like for the user? Well, they're first going to be prompted to sign in, and then they're going to be prompted to consent to any permissions. Now that is if they had not already granted those permissions, they are going to get that consent dialog. The second time that they do it, they won't get that consent. The user is going to be prompted to consent that, and once they do that, that's going to flag that this user has granted this Azure AD application these permissions on their behalf on the Microsoft Graph. And then data is going to come back. And you're going to use the data that comes back and display that on the page. So a quick overview of what's going to happen in this sample is that first they're going to go hit the page. That's going to send them over to Azure AD to go log in and obtain an access token. That access token is then going to be added to the Microsoft Graph client, which is then going to make a call to the Graph REST API, obtaining calendar events, and returning that back to our React application, where we can then use the call inside of our app. Now, let's understand exactly what's going on here at the low level. Once the access token is acquired, your application is going to continue to call the Graph API without going through the steps to obtain an access token. It just caches it locally and keeps using it. At some point, the token is going to expire and a refresh token can be used to obtain a new access token without requiring the user to log in again. Now, let's understand what the Microsoft Authentication Library and what it's doing and why it's important. It's necessary to understand what it's doing for you. Your code follows a very simple pattern to acquire the token silently, such as if it's trying to get it from using a refresh token. And if that fails, it will then prompt you to get the token interactively by logging into Azure AD. Your code, though, doesn't need to manage the login pop-up screen, the interaction for obtaining consent, and it doesn't need to manage the token lifetimes either. The call to the /common/OAuth v2/authorize endpoint is going to pop up a login screen and request the permissions consent. And it's important to cache the refresh token to request a new access token. This is what the MSAL library is doing for you. There's no action for you to do as a developer to manage the refresh token. You can create a custom cache for persistence, but the MSAL library is going to manage the token lifetime for you. It's just important to understand what the library is doing so you understand under the covers what's going on. So let's take a look at this last demo inside of our application. What we're going to do is we're going to pull it all together and we're going to implement the Microsoft Graph API to call in the graph to get items from my calendar and display them inside of the React application. In this last demo, let's take a look at what we're going to do to incorporate the Microsoft Graph into our application. And in this example, or in this demo, remember what we're going to use is the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK. So what I'm going to do is I want to configure my application to get calendar events from Outlook. And so I'm going to do that here inside of my graphservice.js file. So what I've done is I've created a get events method. I've added this to it. And what this does is gets an instance of the authenticated client, and then I'm going to call client.API to get all of my events for me, and then I'm specifying only specific properties that I'm interested in. I'm sorting it by a certain create date time in descending order, and then I'm going to issue the get to go issue that request. Now, I've created a new component here called calendar.js, and this is what's going to be used to display the results of this call. So if you take a look at this, I've got a little utility here for formatting the date time, but the important part here is I have a state set up for all my events, and then here in the render method that you can see where I'm doing the rendering, this is where I'm going to display the calendar. So you see I have a header row, and then I'm going to write out all of the results inside of different rows. Now, in the component did mount, this is like my initialize method. And so what I'm going to do is I'm fetching an access token using the MSAL client-side library in JavaScript. And then I'm going to fetch all my events using the get events method from my graph client or my graph service that I created. And then once I get all those events, I'm setting the state. And that's what's going to trigger the re-rendering of the application. So let's take a look and see this run. So I'm going to come over here to my app and just do an npm start. So wait for this to spin up and spin up our browser. All right, so we're still logged in from the previous time we ran this, but now we have our calendar event. So let's go to our calendar component, and here we can see all of our calendar items coming back from the Microsoft Graph, taking advantage of the client-side nature of the Microsoft Authentication library and the Graph JavaScript SDK. And so in this demo, you saw how easy it was to create a full-blown React-based single-page application to show calendar items coming back from the Microsoft Graph in a React-based application. Again, if you would like to see the step-by-step process for creating this application, I'd recommend you take a look at the module that's associated with this screencast and look at the demo code that is provided, as all of the demos that I've done you can find the final solution for all of them inside of the module, and you can find a step-by-step hands-on lab that walks you through creating each one of these as well. Now we've reached the end of this screencast for this module. You've seen a lot about how to do development with the Microsoft Graph based on the topic that we've covered here. Keep in mind that everything you saw here inside the screencast accompanies a training module where you can find slides and hands-on labs and all the final solutions that we showed you in the demos inside this screencast. So if you want to learn more, I'd recommend you check out the module associated with this screencast. Again, if you remember, the demonstrations that we showed you in this screencast, they don't walk you through every single step of building the application. Rather, we just look at the final solution that we've built and we see it running, which you can expect to see. If you want to see how to go about building a solution just like this, go look at the hands-on lab exercise that accompanies this module, because each of the demos corresponds with a specific exercise from the hands-on lab. So we have steps where you can walk through each one of these things. Again, one of the reasons we don't do all of the individual steps in the screencast is because things change on a very rapid cadence in this new cloud world, and different dependencies change, version numbers change, maybe a couple steps in screen caps are going to change as well in the hands-on lab. And so we keep the hands-on labs updated every couple months. But the videos would get out of date really quick if we tried to do that. So to save a little bit of time, we've just showed you the final solution, and we maintain the hands-on labs that you can take advantage of. I hope you got a lot out of this. There are a lot of other training modules associated with the Microsoft Graph that I'd recommend that you definitely take a look at. We've also got a couple additional links here that are at the end of the slides in the training module where you could use to learn more about this technology. So again, hope you got a lot out of this and you enjoyed this screencast. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch it.